Mm-hmm. They said, "The bakery doesn't belong to you anymore, Mom. It belongs to all of us now." My son said it the way you'd explain a contract to someone who didn't understand the fine print. Calm, measured, like the words were doing me a favor. I stood in the middle of my own kitchen, the one I'd been opening since 6 in the morning for 23 years, and I listened to him say it without a single crack in his voice. I looked at my daughter-in-law. She was already scrolling through something on her phone. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I just untied my apron, folded it over the back of the stool where I'd always hung it at the end of the day, and said, "I see." That was a Tuesday. By Friday, the bakery had a new owner, and it wasn't my son. I want to tell you how that happened, not because I need you to understand me, but because I think some of you already do. My name is Dorothy. I'm 68 years old. I live in a small town in Tennessee that most people drive through without stopping. I've been making bread since I was 9 years old, standing on a step stool beside my grandmother in a kitchen that smelled of yeast and wood smoke. She had a saying she repeated so often I thought she'd stitched it into the walls. A woman who feeds people well will never go hungry herself. I believed her. For most of my life, she was right. My husband Gerald and I opened the bakery in 1999. We had almost nothing. A small business loan, a rented space on Maple Street with a cracked front window and a back door that stuck in the rain. Gerald fixed things with his hands. He rewired the display case, replaced 3 oven elements, and built the wooden shelves along the east wall from lumber he salvaged from a torn-down barn nearby. He had a gift for making something out of almost nothing. We named the place Morning Rise Bakery, Gerald's idea. He said it sounded like a hymn, like something that started over every day. He was right, it did. For 12 years, we built that bakery into something real. Not famous, not flashy, just steady. The kind of place where people came in for 1 loaf of sourdough and left 40 minutes later because they'd run into a neighbor. The coffee was strong, the cinnamon rolls were unreasonable in the best possible way, and on Saturdays, I baked a rum cake that sold out before 9 in the morning every single week. Gerald handled the books. I handled the baking. We handled each other. He passed in 2011. Heart attack, sudden, on a Sunday afternoon. He was sitting in the garden pulling weeds, and then he wasn't doing anything at all. I found him between the tomato plants. I held his hand until the ambulance came. The whole neighborhood was quiet for weeks after that. The particular quiet of people who don't know what to say but feel the weight of what's missing. The months after Gerald died, I kept the bakery open because I didn't know what else to do. Getting up at 5 in the morning gave me a reason to get up at all. I baked more than I needed. Gave away the excess to the food pantry, to neighbors, to anyone who came by looking lost. People kept telling me to take time off, to grieve properly. But baking was my grief. Flour on my hands kept me from falling apart. My son Michael came home for the funeral and stayed 2 weeks longer than he'd planned. He was good that way then. He helped with the paperwork, sorted through Gerald's files, made sure the insurance was handled. He was 36 and capable and kind in the efficient way of someone who loves you but doesn't quite know how to say it. He'd moved to Atlanta 3 years earlier for a corporate finance job, and he'd built a life there that looked nothing like the one we'd raised him in. Sandra came with him. She was polished in a way that made everything around her seem slightly underdressed. Not unkind. She was never openly unkind, and that was the thing about her. She shook my hand warmly at Gerald's service. She helped clear the table after the neighbors brought food over. She said all the right things in all the right order. But even then, in those early days, I noticed the way she took stock of rooms. Like she was calculating the square footage of your life and deciding what had to go. I thought I was being uncharitable. I thought grief was making me read things into faces that weren't there. So I swallowed it and thanked her for coming. 2 years after Gerald died, Michael asked to be added to the bakery's business accounts. He said he wanted to help me manage the finances, that it would be easier for inheritance purposes, that he just wanted to make sure everything was protected. I was tired in the bone-deep way that comes from running a small business alone, so I said yes. The lawyer drew up the paperwork. Michael became a co-owner on record. I paid it no mind for a long time. Nothing changed. He visited a few times a year, asked about the numbers, suggested I upgrade the point-of-sale system. Small things. Helpful things, or so I thought. Sandra's suggestions came later, and they came wrapped in language that made them sound like gifts. Have you ever thought about expanding, Dorothy? A second location could really scale revenue. I told her I wasn't interested in scaling. I was interested in making good bread. Don't you think the logo looks a little dated? First impressions matter. The logo was a hand-drawn loaf with a sunrise behind it. Gerald had sketched it on a paper bag the week we signed the lease. I told her I'd think about it. The Saturday rum cake, honestly, it takes up so much of your time for what it brings in. Have you run the numbers? I told her the rum cake wasn't about the numbers. She always smiled when I pushed back. That practiced, patient smile that said she was choosing not to fight me for now. The first real thing she took was the recipe box. It was a wooden box Gerald had built for me, our second Christmas in the bakery, painted pale yellow with my initials on the lid. Inside were 3 decades of recipes, handwritten, some on index cards, some on torn notebook paper, some on the backs of envelopes. My grandmother's biscuit formula, Gerald's mother's apple butter, the rum cake recipe that I'd spent 11 months perfecting and had never written down anywhere else. Sandra offered to digitize it. She said it was for safekeeping, that physical copies could be lost in a fire or flood. I said I'd been keeping them safe for 30 years without a hard drive. She took the box anyway. One afternoon when I was at a supplier meeting, said she'd make digital copies and return it. The copies came back 2 weeks later, printed on plain paper and placed in a 3-ring binder. The wooden box sat in the kitchen drawer at Michael's house. And when I asked for it back, Sandra said, "Of course, I just have to find where I put it." She never did find it. That was small. I told myself it was small. Other things followed. She redesigned the bakery's social media, something I'd never cared much about but had handed over to a college student I paid part-time. Sandra took it over, said she had a better eye for branding. The aesthetic changed. The photos became cool and minimal. All white surfaces and small portions arranged like jewelry. The comments from our regulars were polite, but confused. "This doesn't look like Morning Rise." I agreed with them privately. She suggested a menu overhaul. Out with the rum cake, the peanut butter cookies, the molasses bread that had been a bestseller for 15 years, in with items she'd seen at bakeries in Atlanta, lavender scones, matcha loaves, oat milk lattes. I told her our customers were farmers and retired school teachers, not people who drove 40 minutes for matcha. She said, "You have to grow the customer base, Dorothy. You can't just rely on the same 20 people forever." Those 20 people had been coming every week for 20 years. Some of them had attended Gerald's funeral. One woman, Patsy, had brought me soup for 3 weeks after he died and still bought a loaf of white bread every Thursday without fail. I did not consider them limitations, but I let some of the new items go on the menu, just to keep the peace. Just because Michael asked me to give it a try. That was the pattern. Sandra suggested. I resisted. Michael asked me to give it a try. I gave it a try. Sandra suggested something bigger. My granddaughter, Maya, Michael's daughter from his first marriage, whom Sandra had never warmed to and who had always seen that clearly, drove down from Nashville one October and sat with me at the prep table after closing. She was 24, studying occupational therapy, sharp in the way that young women are when they've learned to trust their instincts. "Grandma," she said, watching me roll dough, "do you know they've been talking about opening a second location?" I set down the rolling pin. She said Sandra had mentioned it at a family dinner a few weeks earlier. A location in Chattanooga, something modern, urban. That they'd use the equity in Morning Rise as collateral for the loan. I hadn't been told. Michael knows, I asked. She nodded slowly. I don't know. He seemed like he agreed. I finished rolling the dough, covered it, put it in the refrigerator. I washed my hands. I thanked Maya for telling me and sent her home with a bag of rolls and a jar of apple butter. Then I sat in my kitchen alone for a long time. I thought about Gerald and what he would say. He had been a quiet man, but he was not a small one. He would have said, "Dorothy, a partnership only works when both people are treated as partners." He would have been right. He usually was. I went to the filing cabinet and pulled out the original co-ownership documents. Read them the way you read something when you're no longer reading charitably. Looked at what I'd signed. Looked at what I hadn't. Called a lawyer the next morning. Not the one Michael had recommended. A different one. A woman named Harriet who'd handled a neighbor's estate the year before and who came recommended as someone who didn't use more words than necessary. She reviewed everything while I sat across from her in a small office that smelled of old paper and strong coffee. "You hold majority interest," she said. 51%. It's here in the original filing. She tapped the page. "As majority holder, you retain final decision-making authority over operational and sale decisions. He can object, but he cannot override you." I had not known that. I had not thought to look. "Can I sell without his approval?" I asked. She looked at me steadily. "You can. He's entitled to his share of proceeds from his 49%. But the decision to sell, that's yours to make." I nodded. "And if I wanted to sell to a specific buyer, not the highest bidder, you can price it fairly and choose who you sell to. As long as it's not structured to deliberately defraud him of his share, you have significant latitude." I thanked her, paid her retainer, and drove back to the bakery. The confrontation with Michael came 2 days later. He and Sandra had driven up from Atlanta a 4-hour drive on a weekday, which told me they'd been expecting some kind of reckoning. They sat across from me at the big prep table, the one Gerald had built from an old bowling alley lane. And Michael told me about the Chattanooga plan as if he were presenting me with a fait accompli. "We've already spoken to a commercial real estate agent," Sandra said. "The opportunity is time-sensitive." "You should have spoken to me first," I said. Michael shifted in his seat. "Mom, we were still in the planning stage. We didn't want to worry you until we had something concrete." "This is my bakery," I said. "I've been here every morning for 23 years. You can't plan its future in Atlanta and then drive up to tell me about it." Sandra's voice went smooth and reasonable, the way it always did. "Dorothy, we're not trying to take anything from you. We're trying to build something for the whole family. Michael's name is on this business. He has a stake in its success. He has 49% of its success," I said. "I have 51. The room went quiet. Michael looked at Sandra. Sandra looked at her hands. Neither of them had checked that document closely enough. "The bakery doesn't belong to you anymore, Mom," Michael said finally, quietly, like he was correcting a misunderstanding. "It belongs to all of us now." I looked at him for a long moment. My son, 45 years old, in a button-down shirt, who had not opened an oven at 5 in the morning in his life, who had never stayed late pulling a cracked tray from the rack or mopped a flour-coated floor at midnight or answered a 4-star review with a personal note, who had his father's eyes and his father's nose and none of his father's understanding of what it meant to build something with your hands. "I see," I said. "I asked them to leave so I could close up for the night. I didn't sleep much, but I didn't lie awake in anguish either. I lay awake thinking clearly, the way you do when you've made a decision and your body is just waiting for the paperwork to catch up. In the morning, I called a man named Thomas Greer. He was 38 years old and had been my Saturday morning regular for 6 years. He'd grown up in town, moved away for culinary school, moved back when his mother got sick, and stayed. He rented a small commercial kitchen and sold pastries at the farmer's market. He was good, genuinely good, patient with dough, respectful of process. He had asked me, on more than one occasion, over more than one cup of coffee, whether I'd ever consider taking on a partner or an apprentice. I had always said, "Not yet, Thomas." I called him that morning and said, "Yet." He came in at 7 before opening. I told him everything, the co-ownership, the Chattanooga plan, the Harriet conversation, the kitchen table confrontation. He listened the way good bakers do, without interrupting, without rushing to the end. When I finished, he asked, "What do you need?" I said, "I need to know whether you can run this place. Not manage it, run it. The way Gerald and I had run it." He said, "I've been ready for a long time." We shook hands right there between the proofing racks. I called Harriet that afternoon. We spent 3 hours on the valuation, on the sales structure, on how to ensure Michael received fair compensation for his 49% without a cent more. I priced the bakery at market value, clean and defensible. Thomas arranged his financing within a week. His grandmother, it turned out, had been saving for decades and had always wanted to invest in something real. I signed the sale documents on a Thursday morning. I did not tell Michael beforehand. He found out when the title transfer notice arrived by certified mail. He called within the hour. I let it ring. Then he called again. Then again. Then the voicemail started. "Mom, what did you do? You can't just... This is the family business. You didn't have the right. You had every right to be consulted. This was supposed to be a partnership." And then the one that told me everything I needed to know about how he'd always seen me. "You're being irrational." This is what happens when people get emotional instead of practical. Emotional. After 23 years. After 5:30 in the morning every Monday through Saturday. After the tax seasons and the equipment failures and the supplier strikes and the year the river flooded and I lost 3 weeks of product and still made payroll. After all of that, I was being emotional. I didn't reply. Sandra texted once, "Dorothy, we understand you were hurt, but this was an overreaction that affects the entire family. We expected better judgment from you." I put the phone face down and went to make dinner. Maya called that evening. I picked up immediately. "Dad's upset," she said. "Really upset, I know." "Grandma, are you okay?" I thought about that for a moment. "Yes," I said. "I think for the first time in a few years I actually am." She was quiet. "Then, what's going to happen to the bakery?" "Thomas Greer is going to run it. He'll keep the name. He'll keep the recipes." I paused. "Except the rum cake." He asked about the rum cake. "What did you say?" "I'm going to teach him myself, in person. 3 Saturday mornings in a row." I heard her smile through the phone, and I told him to keep it on the menu until nobody wants it anymore. "Which will be never," Maya said. "Which will be never." She asked if she could come down the following weekend. I said yes. She asked if I'd make biscuits. I said I'd make biscuits. After we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table with a mug of chamomile and Gerald's old crossword dictionary, which I kept beside the salt shaker and never used, but also never moved. Outside, the streetlight on the corner was doing its usual thing, flickering when the wind changed. The neighbors had a dog that barked at nothing every night around 9. Somewhere down the block, a screen door slapped shut. Everything ordinary, everything fine. I had moved out of the bakery's back office 6 days before, cleared my personal items into 3 boxes. My grandmother's photograph from the shelf above the register. The old-timer Gerald had used before we bought the digital one. A chipped mug that said, "World's okayest baker." A joke gift from Maya years ago that I'd somehow used every single day. The wooden recipe box, which Sandra had eventually left behind in a bottom drawer when she cleared her things out, and which I found wrapped in a dish towel like something she'd meant to keep but forgotten about. I unwrapped it slowly at my kitchen table. The painted yellow was faded at the corners. The latch still stuck the way it always had. Inside, the recipe cards were exactly as I'd left them. My grandmother's handwriting on the biscuit card, faint and careful. Gerald's mother's apple butter on a piece of graph paper he'd trimmed to fit. The rum cake recipe on a folded envelope, stained with something that might have been vanilla or might have been thyme. I held that envelope for a long time. There's a kind of grief that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive the day of the loss. It comes later, quietly, when you're holding something small and ordinary and it suddenly weighs more than it should. That was what I felt, sitting at that table. Not for the bakery. I'd made my peace with that. Not even for Michael. Not yet. But for the version of things I believed in for a long time. The version where he'd understood what Gerald and I had built. Where he'd seen the wooden shelves and the rum cake and the recipe box and thought, this is worth protecting. He hadn't, and I couldn't make him. But I could make sure it didn't disappear. I spent the next 3 Saturdays at morning rise before the doors opened, standing beside Thomas at the prep counter. He was quiet when he worked, the way good bakers are. He asked the right questions. He didn't try to rush the dough. On the 3rd Saturday, I watched him pull the rum cakes from the oven, 8 of them, perfectly domed, the kitchen smelling exactly the way it had smelled every Saturday of my life for 23 years. He set them on the rack without touching them. He was patient. He turned to me and said, "How do they look?" I said, "Gerald would approve." Thomas nodded and went back to the next batch. Standing in that kitchen, watching him work, I felt something I hadn't expected. Relief. Not the relief of victory, nothing like that. Just the plain, quiet relief of knowing that the thing you loved would outlast the troubles surrounding it. Michael called one more time, 2 weeks after the sale closed. This time, I picked up. He was calmer. He didn't shout. He said, "I don't understand what I did that was so unforgivable, Mom." I was quiet for a moment before I answered. "You didn't do one unforgivable thing," I said. "You did 100 forgettable ones, and then you forgot them." He didn't say anything. "You never asked me how I was doing," I said. "After your father died, you helped with the paperwork and then you went back to Atlanta. That was the right thing. I'm not faulting you for it." I let a breath out slowly. "But in the years after that, when you came back and started suggesting changes, did you ever once ask me whether I was happy? Whether I was tired? Whether I wanted something different?" Silence on the line. "You assumed I was fine because I kept showing up," I said. "That was your mistake." He said, quietly, "I thought I was helping. I know you did." Another long pause. "Ben," he said, "I still think you should have told me before you sold it." "I know you do," I said, and I didn't argue, because I understood that some people have to lose something before they can understand what it was worth. And that wasn't a lesson I could teach him. Only time could do that. We said goodbye without warmth, but without cruelty. That felt like the right temperature for where we were. Maya came down that weekend with orange juice and a library book she said I'd like, and an appetite I suspected had less to do with biscuits than with needing to be somewhere that felt like home. We sat on the back porch for 3 hours talking about her internship, about a boy she liked and wouldn't name yet, about her memory of Gerald teaching her to count change at the bakery register when she was 6. "Do you miss it?" she asked, meaning the bakery. "Parts of it," I said. The Saturday mornings. The way the light came through the front window at 7. Patsy coming in for her Thursday loaf. I looked at my hands in my lap. I don't miss the last 2 years of it. The version that stopped being mine. She nodded. "Will you do something else?" I told her I'd been thinking about teaching bread making. Small classes, right here at home, 6 people at a time, nothing formal. Just what I knew. Her face changed. "Grandma, people would come from everywhere for that." "Not everywhere," I said. "Just here, that's enough." Before she left, she handed me an envelope. Inside was a card in her handwriting, and a piece of paper I recognized as a printout from a local community college's continuing education catalog. A page she'd circled in pen, A 6-week slot for a community instructor. Applications due the following month. Just in case, she said. I tucked it under the recipe box on the kitchen shelf. That evening, I sat down and wrote a letter. Not to Michael, not to Sandra. I wrote it to Gerald, which I knew was something only a woman who'd been married 31 years would understand. I wrote, I kept it safe. Not the building, the thing inside it. The thing you would have recognized. I didn't seal it. I left it folded on the kitchen table beside the salt shaker and went to bed. In the morning, I got up at 5:30 out of habit, stood in the kitchen in the early dark, made coffee, stood at the window and watched the streetlight hold steady. I had nowhere to be. The feeling was strange at first, like a sound you've lived with so long you only notice it when it stops. Then it settled. Then it felt like something I hadn't had in a very long time. Space. Just enough of it. Just enough to remember who I'd been before I started getting smaller. I poured my coffee. I pulled out my grandmother's biscuit recipe, the one on the faded index card, and set it on the counter. Not because I needed to follow it. I had it memorized, every fold and rest and rough edge. I set it out because it was beautiful to look at. Because her handwriting was still clear and sure on the card, and because some things deserve to be kept where you can see them. I began to measure the flower. Outside, the Tennessee morning came in pale gold through the kitchen window, the way it always had, the way it always would. The town was still waking up. Somewhere down the block, the neighbor's dog barked once and went quiet. I had fed people well for a long time. I wasn't hungry yet, and I had absolutely no intention of apologizing for that. If this story felt familiar, if you've ever kept quiet in a room where you should have spoken, if you've ever handed over something precious and watched it slowly stop being yours, leave a comment. Let someone know they're not the only one. That's how the silence ends.